Hi there, Sam Schiffman here. And today I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk with you about why I've become obsessed with K-pop Demon Hunters. K-pop Demon Hunters is an animated picture produced by Sony. They gave it to Netflix. They sold it for $20 million, but pretty much that's giving it away because they probably assumed it wasn't going to go very far. Since then, it has taken the world by storm. It is now the most watched movie on Netflix. I believe it's actually the most watched thing on Netflix, period. Um, and even more impressively, the songs from it have dominated the charts for a number of weeks, with the title song Golden holding the #1 spot for quite a while. Netflix did eventually decide to release it into theaters, and they made an estimated $20 million just releasing into theaters for one weekend. And what I hear is that it's going to come back out at Halloween, which is just in a few days. So I'm super excited about that. But before I go any further, I really should let you know that there will be spoilers ahead. I'm not going to recap the whole movie. I'm going to actually assume that you've watched the movie. If you're one of those few people out there who hasn't watched the movie, I would recommend that you go do that. But I really want to talk about why I've really become obsessed with this movie. And I want to talk about it in three different ways. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how precise it is. And then I'm going to talk about the storytelling elements of it. And finally, wrap up with discussing some of the themes that I see in the movie. So let's start with precision. There are a number of different ways that we could talk about how beautifully this film is put together. What I've decided to focus on here is really how it captures Korean culture in a really remarkable way. Now, I will admit up front, I am not Korean, but much of what I'm going to be talking about, I've learned from watching other people on YouTube, and I'll make a playlist of some of the videos that I've watched available on my channel. I've watched over 100 of them, so I'm not going to give you all of them, but I'll give you sort of the ones that had an influence on this presentation. Also, I'm not Korean, so I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Korean words here, but I think that there's some really interesting aspects that they made sure they brought into the film. So, for example, these little charms that each of the singers in Huntrix wears is particular to them, and they spent some time thinking about the detail there. We're going to talk about all of them as we go through here, but for right now, let's talk about Rumi there in the middle. She's the purple one, right? And they do this beautiful thing of mixing the purple with the black to show that she has kind of a mixed identity. We also see them represent really interestingly the various demons that are part of Korean mythology. These particular demons are not actually demons, they're more kind of like goblins. They're not necessarily evil in Korean mythology, but more mischievous. But in the film, they're being run by Guima, the evil demon king. So maybe that explains why they're particularly evil in the film. Other demons, such as the water demons, are in fact evil. They're the spirits of people who were drowned, who are trying to pull other people in because they're lonely. Right? Another one is the egg-faced demons, which are actually the demons of people who have died without having a family to remember them. I think one of the really interesting things about Korean culture and general a lot of Asian culture is that there's this big emphasis on family and history and being remembered by your family. And if you die without the ability to have that, without any the ability for people to remember you, you become this kind of demon. And of course, we have the sort of grim reapers of Korean culture in the Saja, which become the boy band in the movie, who, again, they're not necessarily evil in Korean mythology, but with the introduction of Guima, we get to understand that they are kind of evil. Another interesting cultural element that was pulled in is this painting that's behind Rumi as she sits on this throne, right? This is, modeled after the throne of Korea, but also that painting behind it is very particular. And we see her in front of that painting also at the end when or the climactic scene, not really the end, but the climactic scene where she is singing the golden song. And we see this painting behind her, and this painting is the sun, moon, and 5 peaks, which was featured behind the throne of the emperor, king of Korea, because the tradition was that you weren't supposed to look directly at the emperor. So this painting gave you something to focus on as you walked into the throne room. And interestingly, here's an original picture of the first king of Korea, well, at least mythically the first king of Korea. And what's interesting about him is that he is supposed to be the child of a human woman who was at one point a bear and a god. And I think that's kind of interesting because if you look at Rumi's lineage, right, her lineage is that she is the child of a demon or otherly worldly creature and a human, right? So when she sings the line that she is the queen that she's supposed to be, I actually kind of wonder, does that mean the queen is in the sense of a queen diva of rock, or does that actually mean that she is actually descended to be a ruler of Korea because she has that mixed heritage? Another wonderful one, I mean, everybody loves these two characters of the tiger and the magpie, right? They appear throughout the movie and had some wonderful comedy to it, right? These actually come from traditional Korean folk art, which showed the tiger and the magpie. And what's interesting is that in many cases, the tiger actually represented the ruling class, while the magpie represented the common people. And I think what's interesting is there's actually a line in the film where Rumi asks Jinu why the bird has a hat. And Jinu says he made it for the tiger, but the bird kept stealing it, which I think is interesting if you think of the tiger as a ruling class that the common people are actually stealing from. I also want to talk a little bit about Celine. I've put Celine here rather than in storytelling, where I'm going to talk about the other characters later, because I think it's a cultural thing. A lot of people have sort of said, okay, is Celine really the bad guy or evil person in the film? And there's a way you can see that, but I also think that it's not probably respecting the culture quite as deeply as it should be, in the sense that, in many of these cultures, it really was seen as the parents' responsibility to make sure that their child ended up with a good life. Finally, as we're talking about culture, I think, we have to talk a little bit about shamanism, right? Korean culture does have a tradition of shamanism. Many of the Korean shamans are women, which is interesting because that lines up with our mythos, where the 3 huntress are women. Now, what is a mistake is to think that all Korean shamans are women, because there are men. And in his book on Korean shamanism, this guy theorizes that, in fact, the dominating of women in Korean shamanism has more to do with the cultural shifts over time of the introduction of both Taoism and Buddhism into Korea, which made it less of an advantageous role to take, and therefore you see more women taking the role. But regardless of that, it's still a very prominent thing in Korean culture. But what makes it kind of different, what makes shamanism different in Korea, is that while much of shamanism uses music, and shamanism exists across the world, right? Much of it uses music, but it uses it to alter states, so that the shaman can travel to another state, another world, to talk to the spirits. In Korean culture, it's different. The music is used to actually entertain the spirits and provide them with entertainment in order to try to appease them, which is an interestingly lines up in many ways. As when we get to talking about themes, we'll talk a little bit more about how that lines up neatly with the movie. But now I'd like to move on to talk about storytelling and the storytelling elements in this movie, which I think are particularly amazing. So first, what is K-pop? I'm going to start with the assumption that everybody knows what a demon hunter is, right? Anyways, K-pop, again, and I'm not Korean and I'm not an expert here, but I think one of the key elements of K-pop is this desire to make super catchy music, and do that by changing rhythms a lot. And I think what's really interesting is I think that the film actually captures this in a really, really remarkable way. Brandon Sanderson talks about, and he's not the only person who talks about this, but he talks about a theory of plot, which is that you make promises and then you show progress to those promises, and then you need to have some payoff. And the payoff can either deliver or subvert the promise. So you don't have to, when you get to the end, it could be that you fulfill what you promised at the beginning, or it could be in some way you change it around and flip it on people and subvert what you did. But you have to have all those pieces come together. You have to have that promise, the progress, and the payoff in order for the story to work. Now, what I think is interesting about K-pop Demon Hunters is I think that they actually did this in a super catchy way by understanding that you had to have little tiny promises, progresses, and payoffs incorporated in the bigger ones in order to move the story in a really interesting way. And I'd like to talk about that by talking about the beginning of the movie, right? At the beginning of the movie, they need to do a major information dump. They need to tell you all about the world. And as we know as writers, doing an information dump is often frowned upon. But they found a really cool way to do it, which is first they kind of give you this promise that there's going to be this concert. They build up some excitement. And then they go into a long backstory about the demons and what they exist and who the hunters are. And finally, we get introduced to who our main characters are as bigger than life on this beautiful screen. And now we go back into an information dump as we actually learn about each of the characters, each of our main characters, through their fans. And it's done in a really kind of engaging style of a documentary, or that you would see about a band, right? But it is still an information dump, right? But now we're brought in and we're given a bit of a progress to this concert that we were promised at the beginning, right? Where we now find out that the girls are on their way, but they're not there yet. And finally, we're actually introduced to our main characters, but in an interesting way, we've subverted the promise of the fact that they were bigger than life stars by meeting them as they're eating their snacks, which is just a really cool way of doing it. But then we're immediately introduced to this promise of their ramen that they want to eat before the show, but they can't because they don't have any hot water in it. As they're doing that, they find out that they are missing the show, and that they need to get there. And so we get sort of a clock started as Rumi says to Bobby, the manager, that they're going to be there very soon, right? Now we get a delivery on the idea that they fight demons by them fighting a bunch of demons. So they start the fight, but in the middle of the fight, there's still this plot about the ramen, right? They finally get the water, they pour it into the ramen, and now they start yet another clock. So this whole process of, by starting a clock and showing the audience that there's a deadline, it adds tension, right? And now we can go in and fight the demons some more as we have that tension. And finally, we get delivery of them eating the ramen, right? But now we have another thing, which is that the plane has been destroyed, right? And so we get introduced to another thing, which is we get reminded that they are in fact bigger than life characters and that they're superheroes, right? As they casually leap out of a plane, right? Without any parachute or anything like that. And finally, we are delivered the promise of actually getting our concert, right? And then we're brought back to be reminded of what the Hamun is, and what it's doing. And finally, 8 minutes and 40 seconds into the movie, we're actually finally ready to start the movie. So I broke it all down here just to take a look at it again, right? So we had the promise of the concert with the progress towards them getting to the concert, right? We're told that they fight demons. We're given the promise that they fight demons. Then we're shown that they fight demons, right? We're given an introduction to this idea of the golden Hamun, which we'll talk about more in themes, right? Which actually becomes a promise that's a tie line through the entire movie, right? But in the middle there, we have this whole promise of they want to eat their ramen. Are they going to get to eat their ramen? And we get a delivery on that, right? So we get delivery on the eating the ramen, we get delivery on them fighting the demons, and we get delivery on them doing the concert, right? And we get sort of this holdout of the golden Hamun, which is going to take us through the rest of the movie. Another amazing storytelling element that they used, which is not original to them, but they used it very effectively, was this idea of a sympathetic villain in this form of Jinoo, right? Jinoo starts out as a demon with a very compelling goal, which is that he wants to get rid of the memories, the bad memories that have in fact haunted him and kept him captive as a demon, right? He wants to get rid of those memories. He is lured to the good side by a progression of interaction with Rumi, and eventually comes to a point where he believes that there is another way. But there's the big bad demon behind him, Guima, right? So our villain, who has become sympathetic, still has another demon behind him, another evil force behind him, which he is scared of, and he's scared of enough that he's actually going to betray Rumi, right? So he has a betrayal. What's interesting is that there's only really one betrayal, right? It's not a repeated cycle of betrayal, because that gets redundant and boring. At some point, you kind of wonder, why does Rumi keep getting convinced? But with the one betrayal, it really adds a huge amount of impact to the film, right? And finally, we get a redemption for him, as he actually does exactly the opposite of what his bad memories were, right? His bad memories are based on him sacrificing his family for his own needs, and now he sacrifices himself for other people's needs. And finally, he is redeemed. And what's really interesting is that Rumi's sword changes form in his redemption. And some people have pointed out that maybe we're going to get a story arc where Rumi's boyfriend is in her sword, which I think has some really interesting implications. But I promised we'd talk about the other characters too. One of the criticisms of the film is that it doesn't develop the other two Huntrix singers very well, Mira and Zoe. Now, it's about a 90-minute movie. They've done an amazing job of content within that time period. And the creators of the film admit that some of the story had to fall by the wayside. But I actually don't think they didn't develop these characters. I think they actually did a very good job of developing these characters within the constraints of what they had. We have Mira, right, who's seen as kind of this gruff, hard to deal with person, but underneath, she's actually really, really the heart of the group, as symbolized by her wearing these bear jammies. But also, if we go back and look at the charm that she wears, the charm that she wears has a big heart on it. She is, in fact, the heart of the group, the one who's trying to make sure that everybody is taken care of. And then we have Zoe, who's lovely and bubbly and fun. But some people have pointed out that she is a really amazing representation of a character on the autism spectrum, without coming out and dumping that on you, right? At no point does it say that she has autism or that she's on the spectrum or anything like that. But there are many elements of her character that people on the spectrum do relate to. One really interesting example is there are a number of times in the film where all three girls are going to say something at the same time, right? And Zoe often says something slightly different than the other two, and then immediately changes what she's saying to reflect what they're saying. We also get lovely pictures of Zoe in her pajamas with turtles on them, right? And I think the turtle is this interesting representation because it's also on the charm that she wears. Interestingly, on the charm that she wears is the turtle, I think, to symbolize the fact that she's trying to find her home, right? And turtle that brings his home with him. She is searching for her home, but she's found it within this group. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about the themes in this movie. And before I go there, I need to give a quick statement about allegory versus applicability. Now, I put allegory versus applicability into Google Gemini and asked it to do a picture in the style of K-pop Demon Hunters, and this is what it came up with. You can, I'll leave it up to you to interpret the picture. But I think it's important to remember when we're talking about these things, J.R.R. Tolkien was famous for saying that he hated allegory, but he very much liked applicability. Stories can be seen in many different ways and applied in many different ways. And I'm going to represent a way that I see that this story can be applied. It's not to say that that is, in fact, definitely what the creators intended. And it still leaves open the other possibilities for other people to find it applicable in other ways. But I am going to return to the Brandon Sanderson and his podcast in which he talked about K-pop Demon Hunters, and he really liked the movie, but he did have one significant complaint about it, which he felt that it did not deliver on its overall promise. Right? Again, we get back to that promise payoff, and you have to either deliver or subvert. And he feels like it didn't do either of those. He feels like it was the promise was that it would redeem the demons. But I think that is actually a misunderstanding of the promise of the film. I think that really the demons and the patterns represent mental illness. When I first heard Rumi talk about her patterns, what immediately came to mind was a friend of mine who's an alcoholic. He's luckily been in AA for many, many years and no longer drinks. But he talks about the tape in his head of all the bad things, which he can't stop repeating in his head, right? And that is exactly what I heard when I heard them talk about their demon patterns, right? It's that the mental struggles that we go through and the mental illnesses that we have. I think this is kind of reinforced where in the scenes where Guima, the evil demon king, finally is actually able to take over the Huntrix, other than Rumi. What we hear is not, in fact, Guima's voice, but we hear an altered form of each of the characters' voice talking to them about what the bad things are. in that sort of patterns and types, but it's really their own mental problems that they're facing. I think, music has long been seen as a way of combating those kinds of mental problems, right? Music helps us feel good, right? And I think that that's a big portion of what the movie is talking about. We can see the Hanmun is really about a way of tamping down our mental anguish and our problems, right? And the golden Hanmun, the promise of that is actually to get rid of them. But I would postulate that that is the wrong way to think about it. Actually, I think there's an interesting thing, which near the beginning of the movie, Guima, the evil demon king, has a line in which he says, "Don't you understand? If they create the golden Hanmun, we're all done." And you're supposed to think that he's talking to the demons about the demons being all done. But I actually think he means everybody is all done, because I don't think we survive well in a world with no mental illness, with no mental variation between people. If we were actually able to suppress all of those pieces, our universe would not be a very pleasant one to live in, and we would all be done. So the movie does deliver on this promise that that Rumi learns to live with her patterns. She learns to accept them as part of herself and embrace them. And as a group, they all learn this, right? They learn that they can embrace their differences and still live a good life, right? And I think that delivers really on the promise that the movie has around the golden Hanmun, and actually, I mean, in some ways, it's subverting that promise in that they didn't block out all the mental illness; they embraced the mental illness, which I think is rather beautiful. And of course, I have to end with a picture of the cat and the bird, and their comeback, in the hope that we will, in fact, see additional content on K-pop Demon Hunters later. If you've made it this far, I would always appreciate a like and a comment, and happy to have you subscribe to the channel. These are all my links to my various different social things. And thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoy K-pop Demon Hunters as much as I did.